Westfield, New Jersey, December 7th, 1971, was a day many people would never forget. It was discovered a family was murdered in their home, with only their husband surviving. John List was missing, and he would remain missing for almost 18 years. Hi guys, and welcome back to my podcast. I'm your host Lulu, and today is episode 2 of the John List series. Last week, we started off in John's childhood. We talked about how he grew up and his parents, and then we went ahead and moved on to the events that happened before John decided to murder his whole family. And we did go into depth about those murders in last week's episode. So this week, we're mostly going to focus on the investigation and the events that led to John finally being caught 18 years later. And I do want to apologize in advance if you hear anything weird in this episode in the background. I usually record when my kids are both taking a nap or when my daughter's in the other room watching a show. But she is sick this week and has been very needy. And so she's actually watching a show right next to me. And I have her show turned way down. But if you do hear anything weird, it's just her show in the background. And I'm going to try my best to record around, any of the weird sounds that do come up because of that. But, you probably will still hear something here and there. So we're going to start this episode back at that huge home. Their huge home had sat empty for weeks at this point, and nobody was the wiser until the lights of the home began to burn out one by one because they had been on for so long. And pretty soon that huge home was black on the inside, and the only thing that made it seem like somebody was living there was this blasting classical music that was on 24/7. And now, I need you to remember that the family was very reclusive. And so it took almost a full month for anybody to realize something was wrong. The first person to begin to grow worried was actually Patricia's drama teacher. She had told him previously that her father's mental health seemed to be going down rapidly and scarily. She informed this teacher months prior that if she was gone for a long period of time, or if they went on just a last-minute vacation, that he should worry. And it's really sad to me that Patricia saw all this coming. That really means that her father was not in a great mental state, and he was not doing very well at hiding it. Which then makes me wonder how his wife didn't see the red flags and maybe, get him help? I'm not sure about that. But no teenager should ever worry that their father is going to murder them. And it just breaks my heart that Patricia warned this drama teacher that she thought something was going to happen. And her drama teacher had started to grow worried now, because at this point, it had almost been a month since Patricia had attended his class, and he was informed that Patricia and her family had gone on a last-minute vacation, just like Patricia had warned him about. So, this drama teacher decided he was going to go check on the family himself. He had recruited another teacher to join him, talking about his concerns and telling them about the things that Patricia had said to him previously. They decided to head over to the home after the school day was finished. And the neighbors had noticed people walking around the home late at night, looking through the window, and that's when they finally decided to call the police. They were a little worried that somebody was either going to break in, but then they also realized that they really hadn't seen anybody for a long time. Once the officers arrived, the teachers informed them of their suspicion, and that drama teacher told the officers about what Patricia had said to him months prior and about how he was worried. So the officers decided to do a welfare check, and they entered that pitch black house. Once that door was opened, the freezing air hit the officers. The classical music had a creepy feeling to it as the officers walked through the pitch black, freezing home. They shined flashlights over everything, trying to see anything, because the lights were burned out and not working. And during that search, they came across the ballroom. It had a huge curtain that had been closing off the ballroom from the rest of the home. When the officers decided to open it and check that room, the smell of decomposing bodies hit their nose. And that's where they discovered Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr., laid out neatly and nicely with towels covering their faces. While they searched the home for more evidence, because obviously something went down here, that is where they discovered the 5-page confession letter on the table. That letter also pointed them upstairs to the apartment where his mother also laid dead. And one thing they quickly noticed was the fact that every single one of John's faces were cut out of all of these photos. And they only had 5 bodies. And there should have been a 6th, John. It was very clear with this letter, the pictures and everything, that it was John. That John was not forced into writing this letter and running away, but that John was responsible. And so they quickly put out a National All Points Bulletin, or APB, for John. This is used for law enforcement officers to inform them that somebody is being actively sought out for connection to a crime. The only clue that they had found as to where John could have been was that his vehicle had been parked at the airport. But upon investigation, they found no evidence that he had ever boarded a flight. And even though they literally had 5 bodies and just a mountain of evidence against John, and they actually managed to find a picture, which is what that neighbor saw years later, this case turned cold. They knew John was responsible, but they had no idea where he was. They laid the family to rest, at least as best rest as they could, and they were on the manhunt for John. They searched high and low for where he could have gone. They looked for evidence upon evidence. They had the house that they were murdered in. They had the bodies. They had the letter. They had everything. But somehow John was just gone. And despite knowing what happened, having all this evidence, 18 years later, there was still no leads or idea on where John could be. And they were about to give up. But, and I might butcher his name, Captain Frank Moronka thought it would be a perfect story to run on America's Most Wanted. They needed to get his face out there. They needed to get this story back up and running. It had been cold for 18 years, and they had a photo of John. So they needed to be able to reach people around the world who would watch this in hopes that somebody somewhere would have seen John. Captain Frank wanted to get his story and face back out there to hopefully light a fire under this case to warm it up. However, the first time the captain reached out, America's Most Wanted turned them down. They felt as though the case was too old and too cold to cover. But with enough pestering, they finally got it aired. All because John Walsh, I know, another John to throw into this case, was informed of the case and how they were trying to get it aired on TV. And John Walsh had some very strong feelings about this case. His 6-year-old son was murdered years ago, and this had set Walsh on his road as a true crime TV host. He believed that John, the murderer, was a coward and a child killer. So, because at the time America's Most Wanted did not want to air this case, he called upon a forensic sculptor named Frank Bender, which is also a little funny that our last episode was about the Bender family, and now we have a Bender. I just think that that's a little comical. Anyways, he called upon him to create a new-aged, progressed bust of List. And he had gotten his hands on the photo that the police had found of John's face that had not been ripped apart yet. And because they now had this bust of John List's face, and they had John Walsh that wanted this aired, on May 21st, 1989, America's Most Wanted finally aired the John List case, and an estimated 22 million people watched the program. And the same neighbor that recognized John in the tabloids years ago happened to be watching America's Most Wanted that night and came across his case. And by this point, it had been years. But she finally decided to call the tip line on the man she knew of as Clark, on the man who murdered his family. The authorities came across her tip, and they quickly followed up on it. And 11 days later, they found John in Virginia with his second wife, living a completely different life. He was arrested on June 1st, 1989. When the authorities arrested him, they were shocked by the striking similarities that John shared with the bust that was created and shared on America's Most Wanted. It was almost an exact replica of John, even down to the thin black framed glasses they thought he would have worn. It was confirmed using fingerprints that Robert Clark was in fact John List. His trial began April 2nd, 1990, and during trial, John was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, which his defense tried to use to get him a lesser sentence of second-degree murder. They also claimed that he was going through a midlife crisis at the time of the murders, and John was convinced he had saved his family from the sins and had sent them to heaven, and he was just living his life, waiting to be reunited with them in heaven, because suicide was a sin, and he would be condemned to hell if he carried it out. He is quoted in saying, "I feel when I get to heaven, we won't worry about these earthly things. They'll either forgive me or won't realize what happened." John had also admitted to authorities that he knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew he had violated one of the 10 commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." But he still did it anyways, because in John's mind, murdering his family was more likely to be forgiven than suicide, which to me just does not make sense. I do not understand how in somebody's head murder is more forgiving than suicide. Now, neither of those is something good. Neither of those should ever be done or carried out. But I just don't really understand how somebody could think that murdering somebody else is more forgivable than suicide. That just doesn't make sense in my head. But John was sick, and so that's why it made sense in his. And on April 11th, 1990, after 9 hours of deliberation, John Emil List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. And on May 1st, 1990, he was then sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. And upon hearing this, the courtroom burst out in applause. Walsh, the man who had hired somebody to make the bust of John, wished John would get the death penalty because he did not feel like 5 life sentences was enough for this child killer. John tried to appeal his case years later, claiming he suffered from PTSD from his combat experience and that the letter that was written out to his pastor should have been kept confidential. But the federal courts rejected his claims. They felt that his sentence was all but fair. After the case was closed, Walsh kept the bust that cracked this cold case wide open on his desk for many years after. Many years later, John was taken to St. Francis Medical Center for about 4 days. He later died at the hospital from complications caused by pneumonia on March 21st, 2008. And the mansion that homed the murders mysteriously caught fire that following August after the bodies were discovered. They believed it was arson due to the gruesome murders happening there, and after the fire, they discovered the stained glass ceiling that hung over the dead bodies of the family in the ballroom was worth more than $100,000 and would have solved all of John's problems if he had sold it. This is a heartbreaking case of a man who thought he was a saint, who thought he was following in the Lord's footsteps, but who in the end was a mentally ill murderer. And the 5 people that were taken from this world were not saved by John. If anything, their life was cut short for no reason. John List was a selfish man. He was a man that felt the world owed him something and that he could be in charge of taking the lives from people around him. John List called himself a saint, but in reality, he was a cold-blooded serial killer. He felt as though the world was crumbling underneath his feet and his life was falling apart. Around him, his family began to fall into sin, and poverty was at every single turn. So John List, the serial killing saint, decided to take the lives of his family and get himself out of a situation he could not see an end to, instead of just looking up towards God and realizing that stained glass ceiling that hung above them could have saved them all. There may be false or misleading information throughout this podcast. All facts have been researched to the best of my abilities, but accidents do happen. If this is a story you are interested in knowing more about, I highly recommend doing your own research. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.